After a series of traumatic events that made headlines throughout the state, we focus in on trauma here in Spotlight Now and speak to how it is impacting our community.
Yeah, we're talking about trauma at a personal and a community level. We have three guests who are experts in this field. Spotlight Now starts now.
You're watching Spotlight Now with Ryan Kalei-Suji and Yunji Denise on Hawaii News Now. Have questions or comments for our guests? Join the conversation in our Facebook live stream. Spotlight Now, where Hawaii comes to talk.
Well, thanks for tuning in here on this Tuesday to Spotlight Now here in Hawaii News Now. We are going to be focusing in as we discuss on trauma and the impacts that it has had on our community, getting a better understanding of how it's integrated into our community, affecting our families, workplace, and beyond. Joining us first to begin this conversation to start this topic is Britt Young from Explore Counseling. Thank you so much for joining us, Britt.
Good afternoon.
Let's start from a macro level, because I think there are various definitions of the word trauma. And as we get into this conversation, we thought you would be a great person to start this conversation with from a medical standpoint. And how do we define what trauma is?
So as I discovered, there are lots of different definitions. Like you talked about this macro definition of a deeply disturbing event, right? An experience that's very difficult to cope with, perhaps out of your control. That would be this like larger lens. But when you look at the actual like textbook DSM diagnostic manual, it's actually quite narrow. So we can really only diagnose someone with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, when it's been an actual or threatened death or an injury or a sexual assault, and it has all these auxiliary symptoms. So what we like to believe as this larger definition, this broader scope, and truly what I think is more pertinent to the discussion, is actually quite narrow. So when you're going to get counseling, you're going to therapy, it's quite difficult to get that PTSD diagnosis if you haven't been threatened with your life or something like that. So that's kind of the definition, a deeply disturbing, distressing event that causes difficulty in functioning and coping.
Interesting. And so when Ryan and I were talking about this show and kind of deciding to do a show about trauma, what really spurred that was what has happened on Maui, the Maui wildfires, and also what happened more recently in Manoa, those murders of that family that really touched so many of us so deeply. Is there a sort of community experience trauma? Because I think initially when you think about trauma, you think of a traumatic event like you described, violence perpetrated at an individual. What about this idea of community experience trauma?
In many ways, that's what the majority of people on this planet will experience, is like vicarious or proximity trauma, right? Collective trauma. And when you mention the wildfires and you mentioned the Manoa tragedy, that is what these smaller communities are experiencing. And so you sort of, I don't know if you can see my hands, but you have like the actual event, then you have the neighborhood, the community, the state, right? So we keep going out at the island. And so as you go out further and further, it's not as if the trauma gets any less pliable, any less, feeling. And so what we find is that there's a lot of attention given to the community where this trauma happens. And we sort of forget about these neighboring communities, interestingly enough. There's a lot of data to support that after a traumatic event in a community, it's the neighboring places that actually have the most mental distress. And the reason is because you imagine something bad happened in your neighborhood, for example, and all these resources come, support, all these folks wanting to help. Not too many people going to the neighboring areas and seeing if people are there okay. So a tornado, for example, hits a certain place, Red Cross comes, all the things happen. But the neighboring community could have had that tornado if it had just taken a right turn. So they're coping with this. It could have been me. Could it have been me? What would have happened if it had just, gone left or right? When it comes to the Maui wildfires, I can only imagine that outside the impacted community were also a lot of folks who felt traumatized around, had the wind blown this way, it could have been my house. Had the wind blown that way, it could have been my uncle. And so we find symptoms and symptomatic, community members all around. There's no necessarily like mile perimeter to it, but we see it go on and on and on outside the communities. And it can be just as palpable and it can be just as serious, and those folks need just as much support.
And how do we provide that support? And what are some of the recommendations to dealing with that trauma? Because we're hearing from some of the Maui wildfire survivors that are still living through it. They don't have a home. You know, they're living in shelters. They're living in hotels. And they have a completely different reality. So while they're living their day-to-day life, they maybe haven't necessarily addressed the trauma that caused them to be in this situation. How do you address some of that?
You know, it's very individual, and it sort of depends on your own psyche and what you've been through in the past. So a lot of folks who go through a trauma such as the Maui wildfires, maybe this is not their first traumatic event, and perhaps it's triggering or building upon some past traumatic events that have happened around grief and loss. So now you have this complex, very layered traumatic experience, right? So it's worth getting as much professional help as possible and also community support, only because the part of the healing is in the connection. Interestingly enough, there are certain data sets that will tell you that after a trauma has happened and then it kind of fades away into distant memory, there's some of that missing of the collective energy, the collective caring about your fellow neighbor. And so as much of that as can be put into community after a traumatic event, I think it's very important. Just like in therapy, part of the healing is the connection between you and your therapist. So to heal some of the collective trauma, it can be, how is my neighbor taking care of me? Who is there to support me? And that's above and beyond the, where am I going to live? That's more the pragmatic, solution-focused, remedies. But beyond that, emotionally, who is here for me? Do I matter? Do we matter? Does my community matter? What meaning can I derive from this? Is the eventual hope is that you reflect upon your trauma and are able to say, now this is a long journey, but you're able to say, I found meaning through my experience. And I don't know if Maui is there yet. Maybe they're on their way, some of these folks, maybe they're getting the right support. And with the Manoa situation as well, it's hard to derive meaning from any of this. However, if you've been through a very traumatic experience and you are allowing yourself to feel the feelings and go there in a very safe and secure place with people who care about you, at the end of that journey could be a place where you say, I think I learned something, or maybe my community learned something.
You know, it's interesting when you talk about the sort of the rings, right, of who is affected. And I think back to my own experience of when the wildfires happened and the week after, and feeling very fatigued, feeling like I couldn't engage, and also feeling like this isn't my pain, right? That I don't have ownership of this, like that you feel kind of guilty in a way for even feeling that way. And I think that Manoa is very much the same as a mom, and just as a person in the community, that you have so much, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. My husband's like, you need to stop obsessing about it, but I really couldn't. And so I'm interested to know how you see that manifesting, not in the directly impacted folks, but in the surrounding community. How does trauma present, and how do we process it? Because you can say, well, I wasn't part of that family, or I'm not a Maui wildfire survivor, yet I have these feelings.
Are you referring to like some feelings of, I don't know if guilt is the right word, kind of like I feel this way and I'm indulging that, and should I really be doing that?
Can I own that?
Got it. That feels very normal. It's sort of a variation of maybe survivor's guilt or some sort of, play on that, in as much as when there's a chaotic situation that happens, a very traumatic, chaotic situation over which we have no control, we can immediately start going to very strange places, psychically. Should that have been me? If I had been on Maui one day longer and didn't get my flight out, why did I survive? Why did this person not survive? I'm not any better. Like, why did the universe choose to spare this person and not that person? That's where I think this elevated thinking that you're probably experiencing is very existential eventually. It's like, but for the grace of God go I, in the sense of it forces us to look at our humanity and our mortality. It's very uncomfortable, because if we imagine that we are just one storm or financial ruin away from traumatizing ourselves, our families, or feeling that, then what does that say about the world? I'm getting super excited. I shouldn't even do that, but you know what I mean? It like shoves the mortality in your face, and it's okay to feel that you also are traumatized, even, vicariously.
Right, there's a vulnerability there that is exposed.
Yes. And it makes you really step back from your life and go, what does all this mean? What is going on? The world is chaos. And it's also the lens around how much do I really control in my world? And these are scary thoughts. And in therapy, I think you can go there in a very safe place, but how often do we really go there, except when something like this happens?
As a marriage and family counselor yourself, one of the other hard conversations that many parents find themselves is having to explain to their children some of the things that happen, like the tragedy in Manoa. What is your recommendation for those parents who have to have some of these hard conversations about some real life issues or real life events that are occurring, and how they begin to explain what happened to their children?
This is so hard. And because each child is sort of somewhere along the developmental, progression, you don't always know what your child can handle in that moment. So you have a 12-year-old who most days acts like they're 16, but you don't want to explain it to a 16-year-old. So what I've been asking some families to experiment with is younger kids up until maybe early middle school, imagining that their world is lensed around their own safety and security and how they're taken care of. So when these really terrible things happen, typically a younger child will go to, am I safe? Could this happen to me? What does this mean for me? And so reemphasizing safety and security, and you don't have to go into the existential around life is chaos and all the things. But, with an older child, you probably can a little bit, maybe older middle school and beyond. I know my own kids came back like, what is happening to our world? And I was like, well, it's probably time to banter or exchange ideas about how the world can be, like, it's full of so many potentially beautiful things. It's also full of pain and suffering. And with an older child, you can go there, they get it. They don't necessarily make the connection, Ryan, between what happened and it's going to happen to me. Whereas a younger child will go draw a direct line. We had a lot of kids in our practice coming in. There was a moment where there might have been a divorce with the Manoa family, but I don't believe that turned out to be true. All the kids who were going through divorces came in to see their therapist worried that they were going to die because their parents were getting a divorce. So you can see this sort of like direct line that you have to interrupt, whereas with an older child, you can talk about the realities of life. And yeah, it's scary sometimes.
Tell us about a little bit why it's so important to process trauma and what happens to it if left unprocessed.
Well, there used to be kind of a school of thought way back when, which is just like bury it deep down and just like buck up and, especially maybe wartime soldiers, things like that who came home were really adept at pushing it aside. What we found, though, is that it would creep up in behaviors, not necessarily words. So let's just say that you've been through a very traumatic event and you've decided you're just going to soldier on and you're not going to really acknowledge it. You're going to just more or less stuff it down. What we find is that it just doesn't go away. It will pop up in behaviors perhaps such as drinking or drugs or some sort of like behavior that's symptomatic of hurting yourself somehow. Or it's going to show up relationally in your marriage and your relationships. So what I tend to communicate to my clients about is that even if you're not dealing with and processing your trauma, it's coming out somewhere. And you can't always control where it comes out, but you can control the therapeutic relationship, you can control your words. So expressing it and feeling it and allowing a professional to help you through that is helpful. I have a personal stance on it that I certainly go in deep into the trauma with my clients, but I try not to live there so long that I'm re-traumatizing them, obviously. It's a skill to be able to go there and process a trauma without re-traumatizing a client. And that goes the same for really the community too. How do you acknowledge what's happened in Maui get the support you need, and really support this community without sort of re-traumatizing them through almost over analyzing what happened, or continuing to try to pull feelings out of someone that frankly has moved through them. I don't know if that makes sense, right? You go there, but you don't have to live there.
You know, as we talk about some of these events that no doubt are tragic, we in Hawaii are not excluded to things, you know, these types of events. These things happen all throughout the country and throughout the world. We're seeing, you know, wars break out and such.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, with Hawaii's, you know, just the family nature, the close-knit communities, how everyone is somewhat connected, do you think that puts Hawaii and the type of people that we are here in a different category when something like this, like a traumatic event, occurs?
Yeah. In many ways, I feel incredibly fortunate to call Hawaii my home. You know, what you're describing is like a cultural sensitivity, a cultural collectedness, a cultural, like, relational system that I grew up in Georgia, right? It's not there. You just have to trust me. It's not there. It is here. And so when I talk about that, part of the healing from a traumatic event is the relationships. It's you telling me, Ryan, you matter, and I'm here for you. Like, that matters. You've now healed me to a certain extent just by caring about who I am. And so if I had to say, I can't be assured of this, but I believe that our culture here protects us from a certain amount of feeling desperate and so traumatized and feeling broken, because wherever you turn, at least in my experience, somebody is there for you in Hawaii.
That is so
And
reassuring.
it's like an armor. Yeah, I could be wrong. I don't think so, though. I've lived like in 8 cities, and this feels the most like if I fell down on the street, somebody's going to come pick me up. I've watched this happen. I've done it. And within 5 seconds, 10 people are there. He has food. He has a bandage. It's incredibly moving and meaningful to see how people treat each other here. And maybe it doesn't protect us from having traumatic events, but it protects us perhaps from feeling broken.
Britt Young from Explore Counseling, thank you so much for being here today. We're going to be talking more about resources and that network of helpers and providers with Amanda Pump from Child and Family Services. She'll be here right after the break. Stay with us. You're watching Spotlight Now.
Welcome back to Spotlight Now as we continue our conversation on trauma and how it has impacted our community, and some of the experts who are here to talk to us about some of the steps to take for those who are looking for support, but also how we as a community can support each other. During this conversation, of course, on Spotlight Now, we always like to engage you, our viewing audience. You can head over to our Facebook page and ask some of the questions that you may have in the comment section, or by scanning this QR code that you see at the bottom of your screen.
And we want to welcome in now Amanda Pump, President and CEO of Child and Family Services. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for inviting us.
So I want to build on what we heard from Britt and hear from you. You know, you obviously service, thousands of people through various agencies that you help to manage. And I'm wondering how you see trauma manifesting in our community.
What a great question. Well, we see it in a variety of different ways. Child and Family Service, we're a nonprofit. We've been serving our community for the last 125 years. We turned 125 about 3 weeks ago. And so much of what we do supports strengthened families. So about 60% of our referrals come in for counseling or related services. That really is designed to help provide therapy, counseling, and support to those that have endured trauma. So a lot of what we do is about child abuse and prevention. We do a lot in domestic violence, sexual assaults. But we're also seeing a lot of families very consistently having struggled with food insecurity and poverty. And so that's also very that affects a lot of our families in the state, and something that we should talk more about. The crisis that we dealt with the wildfire and the crisis in Manoa, both of those instances has ripple effects with people's well-being, which is inclusive of their lifestyle. And so I think that's very important to incorporate in our work. When we're doing counseling or when we're helping a family, we have to make sure basic needs are intact and families feel connected and supported.
As you're talking about some of these families that you are supporting right now, is there, and you mentioned some of this already, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little more, if there's anything specific that you're seeing that is becoming more and more common these days because of maybe some things that are happening in our community, whether it be, those who are more struggling to put food on the table, or what are we seeing just because of the trends of what's happening in our community that are filtering in to how things are impacting families?
I feel as though families are more stressed. I think food insecurities, housing, the rising cost to live in Hawaii is very impactful. And so how that ripples into mental health is people have a lower tolerance. They're kind of leaning more toward more violent behaviors, more escalatory behaviors. And so I'm seeing that across our state. But if you think about the basic needs people have in order to have stability, love, comfort, those are food, those are housing, those are our finances. A lot of our families have to go to the grocery store and say, what can I afford today to feed not only myself but my children? And so I think that stress is very real. I think that's something we don't talk about enough. And I feel like the survivors of the Maui wildfire and how we're trying to make sense of the crisis in Manoa, we're not talking about those issues enough, but this is who we're dealing with at Child and Family Service. 97% of those that we serve are in the poverty threshold. They are dealing with this crisis every single day. And so we can't neglect that as service providers. And so I think as we're looking at a family through the lens of social determinants of health, we're seeing huge crises with the affordability of Hawaii.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because you think about, we talk about self-care and seeing a therapist perhaps for trauma, but if you are, managing the kind of struggles you're talking about, that might seem completely out of reach. So when you are trying to make sure that the collective is served, is there room for therapy in that equation? Should we just be focusing, or should we primarily be focusing on those household needs that you're talking about? Where do we shift the resources so that we can prevent the kind of trauma that we're talking about?
I think all of us that are doing human services have to see the family as a holistic perspective. You can't come in and say, I need mental health counseling, and ignore the fact that they have food insecurity, they have not a lot of resources, they're feeling isolative, they're feeling stressed, because if you ignore those facts, they're never going to get better. Or if they get better, it's going to be a short-lived experience, and those crises are going to exacerbate the mental health again. And so if you're looking at how do we reduce recidivism and help families thrive, you have to bring in the family in and ask those questions. Did you eat today? Tell us about your finances. Tell us about what resources. Do you have childcare? What does your day-to-day look like? A lot of our families, they have to work 2 or 3 jobs. They have to travel from rural areas into town. And so you're looking at a 50 to 60 hour work week, and then they get their paycheck and then they go to the store and they can only afford maybe a few days of groceries because they have other bills. So we look at the family from a holistic perspective, and I think doing this work, we have to in order to make a family well.
And are you seeing any differences, just island by island, with the needs that may be, something that is needed more on the island of Oahu as opposed to another community on another island like Maui? And how do you support all these different needs that are coming in our community? Because there could be so vast and variable with so many other variables that are involved in that.
Yeah, I think the nice thing about being so big as an organization is we serve 16,000 people a year, and we touched the lives of 110,000 people just last year alone. That's 7% of the state. And so looking at it island by island, every island does have its unique challenges. Oahu, it's really the saturation of need. We see a lot of people coming in on Oahu because it's heavily populated, and we see a lot more child abuse and neglect, domestic violence, sexual abuse cases here. Just because, again, it's so very populated. There's more resources on Oahu. Now look at Maui. There's not enough resources right now because everything, the cost of services, the cost of housing, the cost of basic needs, those costs skyrocketed, and service providers are struggling to keep up. And we expect the demand, the need for a service to actually go up a year or 2 from now. And so we're actually gearing up for that. We saw that post-COVID. We saw that post-volcano. There's a lot of research that says, hey, once people get permanency, get kind of stable, that's when you're going to see the demand for service increase. So we're really gearing up for that. I think one of the areas or the islands that we're really honing into the most right now is Hilo on the Big Island. And why is because they have the lowest health outcomes and the highest rate of poverty in our state. And so it's really hard to ignore that. And plus they're very rural. So there's not a lot of service providers in the areas and expertise of domestic violence, of sexual abuse, of dealing with social determinants of health and wellness. And so we're really looking into providing adequate support because those islands don't have as many resources as does Oahu.
Excuse me. I think one of the things that you mentioned was about, the financial insecurity that so many are experiencing. And there's a lot of shame associated with that. A lot of people don't want to necessarily reveal that and may present that they are in a position that they're not actually in. What do you wish people knew about some resources that are out there, that they can rely on? Because we heard Britt at the end there talk about how if you fall down in Hawaii, somebody hopefully will help to lift you up. So what are some of the ways that we can help to lift up our neighbors? And, and if you are in need of help, where do you suggest people go, especially those who may be a little reluctant to ask for help?
Yeah. I think Hawaii's community is incredibly strong and caring and compassionate. And we've seen that play out time and time again. And so I think from a community lens, asking each other, how are we doing today? But I agree, there's so much stigma still on reaching out for help. And some of it, we think about is excuses, right? Well, I have to work all day. I don't have time to call a number, or I don't know where to go to get the resources. And the help is out there. So I would tell families, hey, don't feel ashamed to ask for help. And again, just our organization alone served 7% of Hawaii's overall population. So it's not just you, if you need help, that's reaching out. There's a lot of families that need this. You're not alone. We're here to help. We're not going to shame or guilt or say, why did you call us? We want folks to call if they need a help. I think too, folks think, hey, I'm not that bad. I don't need that help. Save it for someone that's worse. And I want to say, parenting is tough. Living and raising a family is tough. Having the right social cues and norms is tough and challenging. Come seek help if you just even want to talk to someone. And so we have a great resource called the Parent Line. And that's a phone number you can call, or if you don't like to use the phone, if you're like me, you can text or you can chat. And we just want people to reach out if they want to vent, if they want parenting advice, if they say, hey, my kids last night really frustrated me because they didn't want to go to bed, or my teenager really is leaving the house and they're not asking permission, help me. Or can I just tell you my story? I think when people do that, then it helps them get validation, it helps them relieve some stress and pressure, it helps reduce the stigma. So I say always call, talk story. If you're bringing your child to their pediatrician, talk story there. The more that we can talk about the experiences that we're dealing with every day, the better it is to reduce that stigma and shame and get the help that is needed.
A lot of parents might be asking for that number a little bit later. We'll probably have to share that information later, as we know that it is challenging, of course, being a parent and raising parents in this environment as well in Hawaii with cost of living and other things that we've already spoken about. I want to focus in on your organization as a whole. As you see the demand grow, where there's more need in the community, and you yourself are having to find ways to find resources and make them available for those in our community. You say 77% of our population needing assistance from the organization. How are you managing that? The expectations of a community that may be in need, and as you get out there more and get more information out, there may be more demand. How do you navigate through that and get the support that you need?
That's a great question. I mean, we have incredible partnerships. So we are working with our state because we're gearing up, right? We know through the course of history, having served our community for so long, that after crisis, after disaster, there's going to be a ripple effect. So the more you can be strategic and proactive, the better you're going to be to handle the volume once it comes in. The other thing about nonprofits is that we don't do the work alone. We can't. That doesn't make sense. There's so many people that need our help and service. So we partner with our fellow nonprofits to serve the need together. So we'll start chatting. I'll start chatting with our CEOs, our leaders in our programs, or start chatting with their respective program leaders across the state. And we'll say, how do we triage if the demand becomes too high? Because what we don't want is to turn away anyone from service or have wait lists, because that's not helpful. And so we do our best, we work together, and we really triage where we need to.
You know, when you think about, you've been in this role for some time, working with Child and Family Services in different capacities. I wonder how you've seen the needs change over time, specifically after COVID. You know, you talked about having a crisis like the wildfires or like the initial lockdowns, and we really came together and everyone was supportive. And then, you know, when it lasted so long, we were under this tremendous stress for such a sustained period of time. How do you think that has impacted the needs of our community?
Well, it's almost, we're leaning to now is like embracing ourselves. What's the next thing, right? But I think, you know, nonprofits live day to day. I mean, we have so much demand coming in that we say, what is going on? That not only can we serve day to day demand, but try to get ahead. But you never know what we're going to expect. I mean, no one expected the Big Island's volcano, Kauai's flooding over the years. You know, having COVID and the pandemic and the state shutting down. But what we can do is we can live through our experiences and kind of glean from the lessons learned and try our best to prep forward in case the next one happens. And so a lot of nonprofits is strategic, right? It's keeping up with the demand, but also prepping forward to almost embrace for the next encounter, because it will come. We just don't know when. And I think that's the sad thing about trauma is like, it's such a shock when it happens, right? Because we're so ingrained in living the day-to-day, the routine, that, hey, we got this going on, and then it happens. And so we got to embrace that shock and get through it. I think the other part is, hey, our nonprofit workers are part of the community too. And so when Maui hit, we had 35 staff in Maui. So to expect them to jump into action and start serving the community when they're going into crisis, we can't. So what we did was we triaged the resources from Maui to our other offices across the state, and we said, hey, handle what you need to handle with your personal lives, and let us handle the community from the lens. And we'll fly people in. We set up a resource disaster hotline call to triage calls and to help people through the crisis, the anxiety that was going on. And we just did whatever we could. But I think sometimes we forget that those that are doing this work is actually part of the community ourselves, and we have to take care of ourselves through it.
You know, we're just about out of time, but before we let you go, I wanted to just provide you an opportunity. What would you say for those who are watching out there who are maybe they need support, maybe they're hesitant about reaching out, just generally what, you know, your message is when people are considering reaching out to your organization?
I say do it. There is no question that they have that we haven't heard before. There's a lot of people reaching out, so they're not alone. We're here to serve. And I think that if they have the thought, can I reach out? Can I get a resource? Can I vent? I had a bad day today. Well, just make the call then, because we're here. That's what we're here for. We're here to serve the community, and we're here no matter what.
Amanda Pump, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank
It was
you.
a joy to talk to you. We are going to be joined next by Tia Hartsock. She is the head of the State Office of Wellness and Resilience. What does that mean? What does this office do? We're going to be diving deep into her work after the break.
Spotlight Now with Yunji Denise and Ryan Kalei-Suji. Connecting you with newsmakers from throughout our islands. Going in depth with Hawaii's leaders and taking your questions live. Spotlight Now, where Hawaii comes to talk.
Well, continuing on in our conversation about trauma, and again, we want to remind those of you who are watching that you can always head over to our Facebook page and enter and engage in this conversation. We want to hear from you what your questions may be, or also by scanning this QR code for our guests here today.
And joining us now live in the studio is Tia Hartsock, who is the director of the State Office of Wellness and Resilience. This is a unique office inducted by the last administration, but really sort of stood up by this one. Tell us the mandate of your office and what it means to be trauma informed.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great opportunity for our state. This Office of Wellness and Resilience was created legislatively through an Act 291, and the biggest overall mandate is really to look at addressing unmet needs and barriers to wellness across the state. And the service is really keiki tu kupuna. So it's looking at a lot of how do we get ahead of people that really want to increase their ability to be resilient, our ability to be prepared for traumatic events, our ability to plan across the state on how to respond in a trauma-informed way when crisis hits. And just as you were kind of speaking about earlier, when we have this like prolonged exposure to traumatic stress, what are some ways that we can help the workforce respond to those types of events so that they can better support youth and families in our state?
And why do you think this became such a big priority for the state? I mean, this is something that the legislature had to essentially create during the legislative process, fund. It was then signed by Governor Ige, and then, you know, Governor Green's administration was the one that actually is the first to kind of include it within the department because of timing. But well, why was it so important for the state to take this on and it become such a priority?
You know, it was initially in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we were seeing across the country and across the world, the increase in mental health needs, the increase in the anxiety, the increase in depression rates going up. When we see these large community traumas, we see these increases in mental health needs across the population. So substance use kind of goes up. As I mentioned, anxiety and depression will go up. Unfortunately, interpersonal violence and abuse seems to go up. And so in response to that, and knowing that that was really occurring with the COVID-19 pandemic, the legislature wisdom really looked at what type of office do we need to create in order to better respond, better plan, better prepare when these large community traumas happen, and hopefully, in essence, assist the workforce and assist individuals when they experience their own collective trauma.
And Hawaii, to my knowledge, is the first state to do this. We're kind of a pioneer in this regard. What does the day-to-day work to do this actually look like?
So we are considered the first state to have a office addressing trauma-informed care held in the governor's office. There are other states that have come before that are holding these types of offices, Office of Resilience, Office of Trauma, within departments. But it looks like we are the first state that has been able to do it, to hold it in the governor's office. And you know what it looks like is really first of all, acknowledging that trauma is pervasive, understanding what it does to the way in which we show up every day, how it impacts our behaviors, how it impacts the way in which we cope with stress, and when stress is increased and stressful events are increased in our lives. And so part of it is really educating the public, supporting the workforce. When we have a healthy workforce, it hopefully equals healthier services and our ability to provide social services in a more, what we like to refer to as in a more trauma-informed way.
And when we see some of these events that have occurred, like the wildfires in Maui and other instances where we see a direct impact on so many different levels, whether it be from the personal level of those directly impacted to employers and workers who have been impacted to just the general community, what kind of action does your office do? How are you involved and engaged with the governor or the administration overall?
So we got deployed on the first day of the trauma, and our deployment was to go help coordinate and convene that coordination around the mental health and wellness response for Maui. So the way in which implementing the trauma principles, the trauma-informed care principles like safety, but the big ones are around peer support, right? The big ones, a couple others are around collaboration, empowerment through voice and choice. And so one of the things that we felt was really important to do, and do it in a trauma-informed way, is to convene and to provide an opportunity and a space to share voice and to provide choice for the community. So one of the things that we've done is worked at convening on a first initially daily basis on the mental health response, mental health professionals, private practitioners, the nonprofits on Maui, the health systems on Maui and across the state and government entities like the federal entities, Red Cross and FEMA were at the table from the very start. And then some of our national supports were able to all convene on a daily basis at noon. So we did a Zoom call, and have been doing it ever since. So for the first, I'd say, 8 weeks, we did a daily call, and then we switched to every other day. And in those calls, it's really an opportunity to, first of all, get information out. Primarily, it really is to also hear from the voices who are working in the community on what the needs they're seeing that day, so that we can work on a systemic level to address those barriers that are systemic barriers. So first of all, we want to see what the voices are saying, that the needs are of the families, what the barriers are, and then be able to really create kind of a cohesive, collective ability to support each other. So like Amanda was referring to earlier was, you have community members who are working in the mental health and wellness field. They're community members. They're going through this trauma just like everybody else. And so, again, if we have a workforce, then we'll have better services to be able to offer. So part of it, a large part of not only trauma-informed care, but the convening, our ability to, our office's kind of charge to convene was around collectively trying to support each other as a workforce and identify the resources that are out there to better provide for the youth and families that were affected and impacted by the fire, but also by the workforce, so that they could be able to provide a more trauma-informed response.
I understand that your office, or the state rather, conducted a well-being and quality of life survey in February and March. Do you have any of those results to share with us? And how are we doing?
Yeah, that's a great. It's such an incredible opportunity. I think as of last week we can officially say that this is the largest statewide survey that has gone out measuring quality of life and wellness. And so the data that we're getting, and we're going through the preliminary results right now, and the data that we're getting is really talking about measuring social determinants of health. What are the highest needs on people's minds? How do they have access to health? How do they have access to mental health? Who do they turn to when they need support? How are they doing in their workplace? And what types of needs are showing up in those areas? There's also questions about basic needs. So what is your ability to access food, as we were referencing earlier? How safe do you feel in your neighborhoods? How well are your neighbors supporting, how do you feel about your neighbors supporting you, or how do you feel about supporting your neighbors? And so that data that we're getting right now, we're looking at those and analyzing the data as of now, but we've had a huge amount of response from the community and the state workers. So we have 2 surveys out. You can go to health-study.com. Still, that community survey is still live. The state employee survey, so the first question that pops is, are you a state employee? You say yes or no, and it will take you to the community survey. But really what we're seeing is, right now the initial results, one of the data points that came back is 82% of people in Hawaii that have responded to the survey are satisfied to very satisfied with their life here.
Wow. And
Yeah.
if you think about the
That's great.
Alice families, right, you think about how much people are struggling, that is actually a very surprising statistic.
Yep. And again, the more people that respond to the survey, the richer the data will be. And so we have the demographics on what type of population is responding right now. So if we could get more general population feedback, then that would be, hopefully we'll capture some more of those populations to really get a good understanding of what the needs are, what the populations, as it shifts over time, right? So we've got specific data on Maui County, right? Through the county can be looked at. But one of the most interesting pieces that we've seen is that stat so far is, people are satisfied to very satisfied with their life here. And their struggles, people struggle. We have good days and bad days. And again, depending on what day that looked like when they took the survey, it could have been a good day. But we have good days and bad days. And specifically in Hawaii, I think our ability to be resilient is just amazing. The connections that our communities have and the connections that they have within their families and their structures and their support networks. Many people, according to the data that we've seen, their primary person that they reach out to when they are in need of emotional support is their family and friends. And what that tells us is that we need to, this is a kako effort. This is something that we collectively have to do with the state, with the nonprofits, and with our communities, with our families, with our friends. We all need to understand trauma, what it does, and how it impacts our behaviors and our decisions. But we also have to look at the resilience and what makes us so resilient as a people, and how culture plays into that in Hawaii, and how it really helps to lift up people after they've been through struggling and difficult times.
I want to touch upon that culture aspect of it as well, because when you look at some of the issues that the state has to deal with and has to tackle, there are oftentimes very different viewpoints on how things should be managed. We saw it play out with what was happening with TMT and the telescope between a Native Hawaiian community who was strongly opposed to this and others who were advocating for the telescope. We saw just these conflicts, and we saw a lot of times the trauma, the generational trauma that many Native Hawaiians felt during this process, dating back to the injustices that were, displayed for the Hawaiian community. When these types of situations pop up, when issues are bound to arise, and the governor and the administration has to once again find a way to communicate to all those in the community, how do you specifically address maybe the Native Hawaiian issues and that cultural aspect and some of the injustices that are tainting the lens of their experience with government and the way in which we operate?
Yeah, thank you for that thought. I think the biggest piece that, we have an executive order that the governor just signed in February. And one of the biggest pieces in that executive order was the acknowledgement of historical trauma. The acknowledgement that what's happened in the history of the state still is alive today. And so acknowledging that trauma when part of the history is still kind of intergenerationally passed down in the way that we cope with stress, in the way that we respond to injustice, in the way that we, teach our kids on what wellness looks like and what resilience really is. That intergenerational piece, we often look at the intergenerational trauma piece, but there's also a very important concept about intergenerational resilience and knowing that, not only knowing that your ancestors went through a certain traumatic event or history, but knowing that what you do today is that strength and that resilience in getting through those situations is still very much alive. And oftentimes it gives people, knowing their culture, knowing their history, knowing their ancestors' struggles, gives them that strength and will to continue to persevere when things get challenging and when struggles occur. So to me, if we start off acknowledging that there is historical trauma and it happened, and how do we look at then when there's a disproportionate representation of Native Hawaiians in our systems? We can also look at it as just what happened in Maui. There's an incredible community that responded without support and just organically responded with boats coming from other islands. Immediately, community members helped each other immediately. And that, to me, is cultural connection. And that comes from people's ability to feel connected to their culture and feel connected to their communities. And you can't take that away from people ever. So just acknowledging that there is strength in the culture and there's strength in knowing the history. And even though there's, again, some challenging times that occurred, there's always our ability to learn and gain that knowledge from ancestors and persevere and move forward.
I'm interested, in doing research for this program. It occurs to me that we all have trauma. Like, is there any person that is alive in the world that is not walking around with some kind of pain? And knowing that, how should that inform how we all relate to one another?
Yeah, it's so pervasive, right? Trauma is pervasive. It's everywhere. If we've lived, this is what I always like to say, if we've lived this long, we know what grief feels like. We've lost, we've loved, and we know what that grief feels like. And there's obviously varying degrees of people's experience with trauma. Some have very complex chronic trauma. And the concept of going from COVID-19 as a global pandemic to something like experiencing climate change and economic hardship and collective trauma, we look at that as kind of cascading trauma, this one thing after another. And there is studies around epigenetics and our ability on a cellular level to be more resilient. But when we understand that everybody has experienced some type of trauma, we go into every interaction that we have. We approach them with compassion. We approach them with the understanding that some of their behaviors might be as a result and the root cause of trauma.
We have about a minute left, but before we wrap up, just generally, if people are still curious about your office and what's next for you, it's very rare that the state adds new departments. So you're one of the few, if not the only one, but what message do you have for those who maybe have more questions about what your office does and how they could be supported by it?
Well, we were right in the middle of strategic planning when, as we started up when the wildfires hit. So we are still in the process of developing our website. Hopefully it will be much more robust in the next month or so. But we're on Governor Green's webpage. We have a tab, Office of Wellness and Resilience, but we have an email, gov.owr@hawaii.gov, that anybody can email. And anybody can come to our Wednesday meetings too that are convening, so they can email the office to get the information. But hopefully we'll have more of a robust website with information soon.
Tia Hartsock, thank you so much for being here today. It was a really enlightening conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching. Stay with us. Spotlight now continues right after this.
Spotlight Now with Ryan Kalei-Suji and Yunji Denise on Hawaii News Now. Have questions or comments for our guests? Join the conversation in our Facebook live stream. Spotlight Now, where Hawaii comes to talk.
What an interesting conversation today on trauma. We heard from 3 different experts in the field, really getting a wide range of thoughts and comments about how members in our community are dealing with trauma, what we're seeing overall, and really how the state is actually getting involved as well.
Yeah, and also hearing from Amanda Pump about the resources that are available to all of us. If you need help, please reach out to Child and Family Service or dial 211 from Aloha United Way. There are resources out there. We know that so many families are under so much stress. And really interesting, you know, that last comment from Tia about how we're really all walking around a bit wounded, if you will. And, you know, at the end of the day, we need to treat each other with a lot of aloha.
But, you know, we really are hearing, and I think it's a conversation that many are having about how people are getting over some of these traumatic events that we've seen throughout the state, specifically what's happening on Maui. An interesting note where Britt at the beginning talked about how many people are just kind of going through the motions right now because they are just trying to make it by day. And it is that trauma that maybe is not addressed that could pop up later. You heard from her and her advice about trying to make sure that people aren't necessarily just neglecting it, but really addressing it.
Yeah, and one person who is working on bringing more resources to Maui is Senator Brian Schatz. He is our guest in studio live next week. We'll talk about the efforts on the federal level to bring more dollars to that community. There are a lot of concerns about what happens when the federal money runs out. What is next for Lahaina? We'll be unpacking all of that with the senator live right here on Spotlight Now.
We want to always encourage you to be involved in the conversation. You can head over to our Facebook page on Hawaii News Now and enter your comments throughout the conversation. We always continue to check them in. We really would like to have you involved and engage in these conversations that we have. So we hope you'll join us next week for Senator Schatz and our conversation with him. We leave you this afternoon with a beautiful shot of the Honolulu skyline. We'll see you all right here next week for another episode of Spotlight Now.